So this talk is called Compose Yourself. It's about different kinds of composables. But really, it should have been called Jessica's Love Story with Vue.use, because that library has saved my ass more times than I can count. I've deleted so much code because of Vue.use. And in this talk, we're going to talk about how it inspired me, how Vue.use's code base inspired me to think differently about how I approach writing composition functions and how I design the APIs of composition functions, just by categorizing and understanding the different kinds of composables that we have and that we can write. So, my name is Jessica Sachs. I go by Jess. I work as a staff engineer at PathAI. Many of you may know me from my Cypress days. I recently left Cypress in July. You can redirect all Cypress questions now to Mark Noonan personally at his Twitter handle. He prefers DMs directly, with stack traces. So stack traces in images into Mark's DMs, please. All right. So previously, that's what I did, is I led product and engineering for the entire component testing team, which was a lot of work. And at the end of that, I was like, but what would it be like to use it? And an opportunity came along to design a design system, and I was like, oh no, now I can use the tool I built again. And I went for it, and I was like, I'm gonna be the user that I designed the tool for. I'm a Faker.js maintainer. Who here knows what that means? So a lot of you read Hacker News, very nice. That was a fun ride in January. And I generally work in the Vue, Vite, and Vitest ecosystems. So you'll see me around in pull requests and issues, etc. And you can find me on Twitter. Please don't email me. You won't get a response. My Mastodon is pinned to the top of my Twitter. I'm just building it up over time for when the eventual implosion happens. So, introduction to composables. In the Vue docs, it says, in the context of Vue applications, a composable is a function that leverages Vue's composition API to encapsulate and reuse stateful logic. Cool. And that's how I was introduced to composables. The second time I was introduced to composables was in a talk that Anthony Fu gave. And he describes that composables set up connections between data. Okay, still like really abstract, but okay. And before the composition API was available, all that we had available to us to share reactivity, Vue's beautiful reactivity API, the reason that many people love Vue is its reactivity API. The only way we had access to that was through mixins. So not only are you within a root Vue instance to even start to use the mixin, but you're also not sure where a lot of data is coming from, and so code reuse becomes very difficult, and people oftentimes turn to vanilla JavaScript when they need to reuse things, right? Cool. So once I learned about the composition API, I understood that it was powerful. I was like, sweet, I don't have to rewrite all my code every time I want to share it. But I knew that there was something missing, and I'd had to write mixins before. I knew it was a major improvement, but there was this cool visualization that Evan created. The first time he announced the composition API, the first time he made that composition API RFC that some of you, show of hands, who has read the giant RFC on the composition API? Hands, 2 hands? It has like 400 comments or something on that RFC. It's giant. And he shared this photo. And it talked about visually how you can view the composition API, right? In the options API, everything has a home, right? Data lives here. Data lives here, computeds live here, and methods live there. Watchers over there. And everything has a place. It's very nice. And you really like that, specifically you, as we talked about over breakfast. And in the composition API, everything is grouped by concern. So it makes it much easier to quite literally put your cursor at the top of the red section on the left and bring it all the way down, cut and paste that into a new JavaScript file. And I understood how the options API could map to the composition API, how I could reuse or move some data from one side to the other. That made sense to me, The component code was now grouped by feature instead of organized by data and methods, and this seemed very natural to me. It was a one-to-one mapping. And I felt comfortable refactoring my component logic into external files, and I began creating composables. One for the red section, one for the purple section if it needed to be reused across multiple components. I could start deleting code. Okay. And I felt like something was missing, maybe like a G or something. Oh, there it is. And after refactoring my data, methods, and computed props into composables, I just didn't know what else to do with the composition API. And I was like, is this overbuilt? Like, what are all these other methods for? Like, why can't I just use ref and watch effect and computed? Like, what else is all these lifecycle hooks for? Like, I felt uninspired, and I liked the reactivity paradigm, and I wanted to see, it's like a way of programming. Like, I liked programming with reactivity, setting up those connections I talked about in the beginning, right? Anthony describes composables as setting up connections in between data, relationships, right? And you'll see what I mean when we get into code examples. And I like this paradigm, this way of coding, and I wanted to see what kinds of patterns it unlocked. Intro View Use is a giant collection of view composition utilities. It's huge. And to prove the point, I have a 15-second transition. And this is going to scroll for 15 seconds. And I'm going to be quiet. All right, so you have everything in View Use that you would normally need for a basic application. You have integrations into things like RxJS, into View Router. And I was like, wow, there are a lot of use cases for composables. And at the top here, let's see if we can get to the top. Yeah. They have categories. They have categories on the right side here. You're right, yeah. They have categories of core and add-ons and state types of composables, functions, elements, browsers, sensors, use Bluetooth, network, animation, reactivity, array randomly, time, and utilities, whatever utilities means. And I was like, okay, these are helpful. You kind of segment composables by category. If a little arbitrarily, you can categorize them. I was like, all right, that's interesting. So I began to use this as a base for the talk that we're in right now. And I created different kinds of composables, and I created a mind map. And that's going to be the basis for the rest of this talk, is this mind map I created, kind of using it as inspiration. So we have, I think I had seven different kinds of composables. And we'll go into each and do an example of each. So we have state, component, connections, reactified functions, library integrations, DOM, and browser. And a few of these will be intuitive to you. A few of these will be the first ones that you're like, okay, yeah, one-to-one mapping, left and right. We can turn our options API component into a script setup component. This makes sense. Easy. Some of these will change the way that you think about composables and components and reactive programming in general. In particular, the two crazy ones are connections and reactified functions. And I leave those for last so you don't leave me and jump to another track. Not really. That's not why they're last. So, actually, could I possibly bother you, Cecilia, for a drink of water? That would be lovely. Thank you. All right. So, boom. I forgot to hit magic move. But here they are, spelled out on the left. And we're going to talk about them in that order. We're going to talk state first. State is going to be the most intuitive for everybody. So state I break down into two different types. We have component state, that's our one-to-one mapping, right? Data becomes ref, thank you. Computed becomes computed. Methods just become functions, anonymous lambdas that don't reference this. Woo! Some examples. Use toggle, use cycle. They're self-contained, stateful utilities. How many times have people written, I don't know, a modal, where you need to take a toggle and have it either be visible or hidden? Yeah, hands? Lovely. How many times have you had a switch component that needs to be on or off? A Boolean that can toggle if it's not already falsy. And then how many of those components have an initial value? Yeah? Cool. So I wrote that component so many times, and it sometimes is a switch, sometimes it's a toggle, sometimes, I don't know, shout out answers. What else do we have that has initial state? Yeah, I couldn't think of anything either. But what do you got? Light mode, dark mode, yeah. Things that have this initial Boolean state that you generally might want to override with a value, and you might want to turn on and off, toggle buttons, etc. So that was very intuitive and about where my intro to Composables stopped. And then we talk about application state. Okay, one-time global state, Pina. Who here knows what Pina is? Lovely, the little pineapple makes its way around. So it has this, it's basically provide inject. There was a talk by Daniel Kelly, who if you've been camping in this room all day, you know, where he dives into the Pina source code and explains to you just why it's a bad idea to write your own provide inject with a reactive object. Like he talks about all the different things that Pina does to make it better than what you would roll yourself. So Pina is an example of one-time global state. But it's just a view first example. You can also integrate view into immer and xstate. You could also integrate it into Urkel, which we Googled when we were like, how do you pronounce Urkel? And unlike view, they don't have that little button on the homepage that's like, how do you say Vite or view? They didn't have one of those. I had to actually look for a YouTube video to figure out it's Urkel. So, component state is visible. We just went over this. This should look pretty reasonable. Toggle visibility, and you always name it something different every time. Even though it's doing the same job, you always name it something different. You could use toggle TS. Independently testable, has this idea of an initial value, probably want it off by default maybe. And then you would return it and use it. And now you have something standard. Application state. Use counter store. This is an example of Pina. And how many of you knew that you could use Pina like a setup function? Nobody. Okay. So newly released API for Pina, a few weeks at least. You can use Pina just like a setup function. You can return what you want out of Pina. And so you can organize your Pina stores, not only by everything has its place, right, with actions and such, but also just like a setup function, just like a headless component. You give it its provide inject key at the front, and then you give it basically its method to define what's reactive and what's not. And here's how you would do it with Immer. Immer's a vanilla state management library. You may or may not want to eject out of view using shallow ref, right? You don't want to watch for deep changes, which is the default for view. You might want to use something shallow and let Immer handle the internals, or another state management library that has its own proxies. This is also a little bit of overlap into the library integrations kind of composable. But this is how you would make an immer composable. These are straight from the Vue docs, by the way, in the state management section. Here's an X-state composable example. You would use machine with options to create a machine, and these are all your normal X-state options if you cared, if you're particularly bullish on X-state. Personally, I tend to lean Vue first because I know Vue first tools get the coolest bells and whistles earliest and have the most users. So I always lean Pina first, personally. So cool. Does everybody feel comfortable with state? Application level state, component state, reusable composables? Yeah? Sick. Browser. Browser came pretty naturally for me too. It's basically a reactivity wrapper over natural browser APIs. And you might be like, okay, why would you want to do that? Because there are a lot of different kinds of APIs that maybe only work client-side. Who here uses Nuxt? 5? 6? Okay. In SSR contexts, the window isn't available, right? You have global. And it's quite convenient to have a tiny thin wrapper around use dark or use Bluetooth that doesn't require you to wrap it in like a client-only component, basically, or a client-only layer. So in browser, we have some examples. We have use Bluetooth, use clipboard, and use magic keys. Let's see. Use clipboard is quite interesting. So the way I was going to make this talk longer, I made it in 30 minutes a week ago, was by showing some live code examples. Let's see if we're going to do that. So here's an example of my input and how I would use clipboard. I might have my input with a show copy button. So visualize an input with a clipboard icon on the right. And you could say, iCarbon clipboard, which is the icon. And if you have the show copy button, you're going to click on it and say copy. And that will change the text inside of the, like some helper text. Ideally, this is accessible. I didn't want to make it too long. I see you, Homer. So ideally, this is accessible. You're changing labels instead of just using icons. But there's a nice little composable. And what you're not seeing inside of this implementation is all of the guts that go into this composable to make it work in other browsers. You're not seeing any of that. You're seeing a standardized UI. Also, the UI is cluing you in to different things, different edge cases you may not need to know that you needed to handle. Is supported. Permissions. Did the user give you access to their clipboard? So this API is giving you all the bits and baubles you need to make a resilient copy-paste. Cute. And then you can make your input, my input, and go on your merry way. What's more is that copied resets after a timeout. You'll notice that we're not calling timeout anywhere in here. There's no use timeout in here. That's inside of use clipboard because somebody had the brilliant idea that people want to show this UI pattern copied and reset it after some milliseconds. Absolutely lovely. And I highly suggest that the next time you consider writing any function, any bit of functionality in Vue, you look and shop through Vue use. You look at that giant functions list and you scroll and you scroll and you ask yourself, is what I'm doing possible with the existing composition utilities that are available? Vue use is only one of, I think, 3 or 4 prominent Vue composable packages. There's also Vue Tensils. Austin Gill did Vue Tensils? Question mark? Not? Okay, yes. Yeah. He's here. He's actually giving a talk in the other room. So the code for use clipboard, dumbed down, looks a little bit like this. There's a use supported bit inside of Vue use core. That's a composable that wraps in a, I believe, client-only detection mechanism. So basically, you can ask for things that are on window, and it won't throw exceptions inside of Nuxt. That's the TLDR there. It also has that use timeout function. so you can compose your composables together. Use timeout function is a utility kind of reactive composable. It allows you to basically avoid top-level async await inside of your components. That's a really useful pattern because suspense is still experimental, right? We can't make top-level async await components very easily right now. You can with composables. You can use async fetch, and your reactive connections, as Anthony would say, they will be fulfilled whenever your promises are fulfilled. The error state handlers will also be fulfilled with the appropriate errors. You're setting up the connections in the setup function, and then eventually, Vue's reactivity will do its thing, and you will know if there's an error, you will know if the clipboard is supported, and if you're making a fetch request, some data will be fulfilled. Connections. So this is use clipboard. It's also pretty easily testable. All it needs is a ref. All it needs is a ref. It doesn't need a component lifecycle. There's no reference to, on-mounted. There's no reference to any of the lifecycle hooks of a Vue component. You don't need to make a shallow wrapper component to test this composable. It's headless. It's headless. It's only the state that matters. It's only the state. It's only watching. And it's only kicking off a timeout. Being able to isolate those bits of reusable code, super useful. So a different kind of composable. Moving on. Library integrations. This is super powerful. Here's how you avoid async await in script setup. You write a composable. You write a composable that eventually, whenever is one of the composable utility functions, actually. Whenever Axios has finished, then data should be populated. So you're going to set up some watches on refs and fulfill this contract is finished if Axios returns a success response. Suddenly, you have the ability to make reactive linkages between your Axios, your vanilla Axios instance, and the refs that you want to return. You can also do things like fuzzy search. Who here has ever implemented fuzzy search? Did you do it yourself or with a library? Library? Library. I think Mark and I wrote that thing together for Cypress. You had your hand up? Library? Did you try to do it vanilla and fail? Yeah. Tried to do it vanilla and fail? Yep. No, we knew better, yeah. Sorry, that was loud. Yeah. What? You used Fused in the past? Yeah. I think you recommended it. Okay. So there are two demos for this one. There's Fuse, which is the fuzzy search demo, and GSAP, which is the Green Sock API. Woo! So in the Vue docs, there is an example of a component. This component has a script and a template, and then it renders like this. So when you type in 300, 3,000, 30,000, it tweens. Tweening is basically how you count up without jank, how you update the DOM like this without jank, as a TLDR. I'm not going to try to explain it correctly. So GSAP is a very extremely powerful library, vanilla JS library, that allows you to do things like tweening. And it would be really nice if we could have something called use tween, for example. Like if we worked at a fintech company and we had lots of stock tickers and we wanted to make it look really cool in our graphs, we would want something called use tween, rather than embedding this directly into our component. Now, if I switch, does this work? Yeah, it does. All right, so if I switch to the Options API, there is really no way to do that, right? There's no way to take this idea and take it out of the options API easily and reuse it in another component. You would end up with a renderless component maybe. There are other ways to accomplish this reusability, but it's also dead simple to go into the composition API. And Vue has this really cool button. It says try it in the playground. I clicked that button, and then I wound up with this. And this is the code we were just looking at with an added style block. Cool. And then what I did is I hit this plus button, and I don't know what magic which core member did to get this thing working, but you can have multi-file imports inside of the Vue SFC playground. And I did that. And so I made something called useTween, which is an interface or a bridge, a library integration, a vanilla library integration between a Vue composable and GSAP. So dead simple API called tweened, gets a number back. You can say that the V model is number, and then you get tweened.number, and that's a number, and you can call to fixed on it. People who are more comfortable with GSAP might be more comfortable talking about what type this is that returns, but essentially we're returning the vanilla GSAP object back with a reactive. So I did write this in TypeScript, didn't I? The other reason I love this is because it allows you to export public interfaces. And so you can, and I picked this up from VueUse, you can export all of your options for your composables, no problem. And it becomes very clear on how you reuse things like use copy, right? Use clipboard, use Bluetooth, use magic keys, because the types are right here. Before everybody filtered in, I asked who used TypeScript, and most of that section raised their hand. I'm going to ask again, who uses TypeScript? Cool. Just want to make sure I'm relevant. Really cool thing in composable design. Pick this up from VueUse. There's a utility type called maybyref. It is lovely, and most of your composables should try to use maybyref. It makes it very easy for testing purposes. Then your tests don't break your types. So I like to use maybyref whenever possible. Tiny tidbit. So initial could be a ref, could not be a ref, and duration could also be a ref if you wanted a slider maybe to change the duration of how long it takes for your tweening to happen. So the watching, the connection building, happens all inside of here. And then we just return the model, right? We return the model that the user can then interact with inside the app. I spent too much time in DevTools, so now I consider all developers to be users. I have to always watch myself and be like, no, dev, not end user. So, pretty elegant, nice way to reuse and recreate this component baked in options API functionality into a composable. I would call this a vanilla library integration. You can do the same thing with Fuse, but you don't have to because VueUse already did it. And so you can use VueUse's Fuse integration. Highly recommend. But when you're doing things that are exciting, when you are working at a particular kind of company that uses perhaps a weird vanilla JS library for reasons, capital R reasons, and you would like to interact with it in ways that are Vue-y, that feel natural, you can always easily wrap it by binding to the initial state and binding to the callbacks that your vanilla JS library provides you. So you can do it with Axios, Fuse, GSAP, this thing called QR code. You can Vueify it. There's already a Vue wrapper for it inside of VueUse. Same thing for Immer and XState, which arguably live in the Venn diagram between state and library integrations. All right. So next, we have DOM. Why is this a separate category than browser, you might ask? Well, I categorize DOM as its own thing because it has some isms, I guess. It has some gotchas. But in general, you want to make sure your DOM composables taken a ref to a DOM node, right? Ref to a DOM node, and then you've got to make sure you clean up. You got to make sure you dispose of that ref, or else you will have a memory leak. So I categorize DOM composables in their own little section because they have different kinds of responsibilities than maybe a vanilla browser API composable would. So you have your little DOM gotchas, take care of those. And then also you have things like use virtual list and use draggable that might do things like a headless composable would, or sorry, a headless component would, possibly, but they're more type safe. And so that's the pro for making things into a composable spelling instead of a headless component. It's easier to get the type safety. You can get type safety off of components. At this point, Velar is doing a great job, VueTSC is doing a great job, and if you're using Vite, there are plenty of plugins to help you generate DTS files of your components, so you don't have to, but it is much easier to get that type safety if you're doing things with composables. Cool. So small demo of use draggable. So use draggable. So we are on the VueUse website. You can drag these cute little things. They take slots. If you wanted to use the component usage, again, you can interrupt. You can think of them as headless components, or you can use them that give you a vslot of the API, or you can use them as straight up composables in your script setup block to create those initial connections. It's very nice. And you take the ref for the L and you bind the style from what was returned inside of use draggable. And that's all the math that you don't have to do to figure out where your component is. There are also very well documented types for each one of these. Not only are there types, but there are also methods that are called when dragging is ended, stopped, moving, started, initial values, pointer types. Apparently, I don't do a lot of mobile development. I didn't even know that this is necessary or important, but it's probably a lifesaver for you if you are in that situation. You're building a carousel, for instance. All of this stuff is no longer your problem. Just use a DOM type composable. We also, I'll show you use virtual list. That one has a special place in my heart. That was my first contribution to VueUse. Mark, did you contribute to this one? No. Ah. We contributed to it for Cypress, actually, for Cypress's spec list. So the way this little buddy works, the demo source should be here. I would also encourage you to get comfortable reading open source code. A good place to do this is the demos of all of the composables and components. So get comfortable doing it. It's where I learned this trick, which is how to make an array of 1 million items and with various models. But the way this little buddy works is you give it, actually I'm not gonna read it for you because it's a little janky, but the return value is essentially 3 sets of props. It's a little hairy, but it's a virtual list. It's hard to do. It is hard to build a virtual list, and to have something that's renderless, essentially, a composable, is very nice, and it's searchable as well. And you may think that this is easy. It's actually not easy to make it searchable. But if you use the library, it's not your problem. That's true in all things in life. Just use the library, please. So back to the roadmap here. That would be a DOM-style component, or composable. If you are passing it a ref, it is probably a DOM-style composable. Make sure you clean up after yourself on unmounted, etc. Make sure that if you're making a library that has a ref for a composable input, that's a funny way of saying that, sorry. If you're building a library, make sure that it's also SSR compatible for all of your Nuxt users. There are quite a lot of Nuxt users, and they will get you. Like, they will come for you in your GitHub issues. Next, we have component types of composables. These kinds of composables are coupled to a component lifecycle. So they care about who their parents are. They care that you have installed i18n, for instance. An example of this would be view router, right? View router wants to do different things, dispose of parents, dispose of children, depending on where you are in your navigation. You generally are not going to be building things that depend on your component's lifecycle. If you are, that might be a sign that you're doing something incredibly interesting, or it's a bad sign. It's a bad sign. So the kinds of libraries that are using get current instance. I looked on GitHub when I was writing this slide, by the way. I was sitting across from Eduardo last week, and we were both thinking, we're brainstorming. We're like, who uses this API? And he's like, well, I do for view router. I was like, and Kazupan does for i18n. Who else uses this API? And we're like, people probably shouldn't use this API. And GitHub was showing only forks of Vue. GitHub was showing the very advanced use cases, make component style composables. And here is a case where you're doing something very interesting. So many of you might be on your way to Vue 3. Who here is on the way to Vue 3? Yeah. So you might know that the $listeners API was how we used to bind to custom pass-through elements. So if you wanted your custom button to behave like a button and take in all the ARIA attributes, pressed, whatever, you would vbind onto $listeners. So this code would be Vue 2 only code. There's a way you can make it backwards compatible and forwards compatible at the same time. You can use something called use listeners. This is something I rolled myself about a week ago. And so as I'm sitting across from Eduardo talking about who uses this stuff, I was like, oh shit, I did. I used that last week. I totally forgot. I must be doing something interesting. Well, I was writing backwards compatible component code. I was writing something really weird. Give you a second. Gotta know TypeScript for this, so. Does this look like a bad idea to people? Show of hands, bad idea, good idea. Ambivalent. Okay. So when I wrote this, I thought it was a bad idea. I was like, wow, this is gonna break. But maybe I'm doing something incredibly interesting. So I posted in the Vue Discord, and I asked, I was like, it's a bad idea. And everybody was like, nah, you're doing something weird. It's probably gonna break at some point, but it's a decent workaround. This is one of those weird instances in which you may want to reach into, literally I named it internals, right? Reach into the internals and see if there are any listeners, probably in Vue 2 dot something, if it has listeners. Or you're gonna grab anything that starts with on and assume that that is a vanilla or otherwise custom method. And you're gonna filter the attributes for the methods and otherwise return an empty object. So that was an interesting component style composable. And now my button works in Vue 2 or Vue 3, and I'm using this in production. So I actually recommend this if you're trying to write universal code. This is a decent, hacky, but reasonable way to make your native pass-through components work. So it's a one-liner. I need to write blog posts that have all this information. So the next thing, and the final two sections that we'll be talking about are connections and reactified functions. So connections are these utility functions that we see inside of VueUse. And when I first looked at VueUse a year and a half ago, I was like, somebody really likes composables. Like, somebody really likes reactive programming, maybe a little too much. Like, why would you need logical and? I think it was called and at the time too, which like made it seem especially reserved. I don't know why. I didn't like it. And then I realized that it was shorthand and everything kind of made sense. I was like, oh, all of these, when put together, are shorthand, so I don't have to keep importing computed at the top of every file. I import computed all the time to do and comparisons, like all the time. And it's kind of declarative. You know, everybody realizes that computed is going to listen to the changes of the refs inside or reactives inside. Okay. But then you can get a little more unreadable, right? What if you add a third reactive property in there? What if there's an or? Suddenly you have parentheses, extra parentheses before the or, and it loses its declarative nature and its readability. And I found that using things like whenever, until, logical not, and logical and were a much better API for expressing those logical connections that I would have just written in vanilla computed and vanilla watch. Here's an example. So I have a typo, but I have something called logical and use fetch. Use fetch, again, is how we're going to prevent our component from becoming async while still fetching the data. And we're going to get a small dog. There's another thing called use image that I did not import at the top of the file. I apologize. And use image takes in a source attribute of a string and prefetches it essentially so that you can show a spinner with the right dimensions until your image is ready. And then it'll immediately load because it'll be cached. So we get our dog image, pass it in, and whenever the image is ready and we have all the data necessary to like annotate our avatar of the dog, we'll declare that we are loaded. Cool. So the vanilla without logical and code snippet is right above it, commented out. So it's const loaded is computed, a non-function. Make sure to unpack the value. Always make sure to unpack the value. And then grab that loaded value back. Logical and is doing that. It also handles a maybe ref, so it doesn't care. It'll make sure that it grabs the value if it exists. It'll treat it like vanilla data if it's not a ref or a reactive. That's very convenient. And then here we go. Here's our template code. Until we're loaded, make a spinner. Otherwise, show a dog with the dog breed data. I'll leave that up for a second. Next, we have the weirdest thing. This one I didn't understand at all. I was like, whoever liked this is really weird. In the early days, before VueUse became kind of like the big name behind composable utility functions, there was another experiment called Vue chemistry, aptly, in which somebody did get a little excited with reactive functions and reactive programming. And essentially, you can reactify anything you want. So you can take a vanilla function, and you can use Vue chemistry and the utilities it provides, and turn your vanilla sum function into a reactified version of itself. That means it automatically unpacks .value. It might automatically track certain things. So you could imagine a very low-cost way to turn the entirety of Lodash into reactified programming. And that sounds really freaky and terrifying to me as a software engineer because that's weird. Like, why would you do that? Like, that makes me uncomfortable. I don't know, does anybody else have that like uncomfortable feeling when you hear you could make Lodash reactive? Yeah, your eyes are huge. You're like, You're like, eh. So you could do it. The place where I like it is Vue uses array methods. So this makes a lot of sense to me. Use map. Has anybody ever written something that maps over a data structure and tries to pull out, let's say, all the first names of a person and put that in a computed? Yeah? A reasonable thing to do. Depending on your data model and depending on the consistency of your list, it may or may not be full of refs. It may or may not be full of reactives, right? That data model may look a little different. If you use array map from Vue use, you don't have to concern yourself with things if they're refs, if they're not refs. Don't think about it. Just realize that you're going to map over each item in the list, perform an operation on it, and get the return value. Again, it's a shorthand for computed. It's pretty declarative. I actually find it much easier to read than some of the computed maps that I've written myself. And with that, I leave you with the list of functions here. Use sorted. It's particularly nice. I've written plenty of computed properties that essentially want to be use sorted. Use array find index. Yeah. All the things that you would normally write in a computed property have a shorthand inside of Vue use. And I don't think this is too much. I think all of Lodash, that's a little much. But certain common patterns that you might do in a computed otherwise, that would be, falling off the page or wrap too much, maybe they deserve a shorthand. So that is my talk. Have a lovely conference. Are there any questions? I think we have time for 10 minutes of questions. Cecilia's clapping in the back. So any questions? What do you got?
Have you seen what are the use cases for doing things in components versus single things?
Yeah, I like to keep my data model inside of my components. So if I have a product list that makes a particular request to a endpoint that's very business domain specific, unless I'm going to have a lot of product lists, there's no reason for me to make that into a composable. I would keep it in I would use the composition API. I don't like to mix and match options and composition API because of the strong type safety you get by default. But I would not abstract that into it. You're not going to use it more than once. Yeah, that's my short answer. Did that answer your question? Cool. So domain specific, TLDR. Other questions? What do you got, Mark?
One question, but it does make me want to describe looking through the list of things that you use to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I want to look at this list right after I write some code, not when I'm deciding to write. Because as we look at this, I wrote computers that do exactly these abilities recently.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that I can process all of these in advance. I can browse that list of things. And so, yeah, I was very actively thinking of recent things that could be shorter.
There are a few, at work personally. We're implementing an undo redo. And of course the internet's either that or the router's angry, router was angry. So these three, use ref history. Built on top, so use debounced ref history. You have somebody who keeps spamming undo. You want to make sure that they're not hitting your backend. Use manual ref history, throttled. They also have very good examples of what the difference is between debounced and throttled, which I find very useful when teaching others. So use ref history. You're going to change a ref. You're going to undo it. You're going to redo it. Extremely useful when building anything that has state. And it has, as you would expect, somebody is probably thinking in their brain, but couldn't that go infinite? And somebody thought about that. So of course, there is a max, and there's also a custom clone function here. So if you wanted to use Lodash's clone deep, or apparently there's something called structured clone that I've never heard of, you could do that. Clona. It's this is what I mean when I say going shopping, is there are all of these different use cases that I could not have imagined existing that somebody needed. And you can also look at this as an example. Here's the history capacity that I was alluding to. You could also use this as a way to figure out how to design composables. So generally, you take in a ref, right? You take in some options. You might provide some methods for operating on that ref and its own state. History flesh timing. Man, I learn so much every time I read these docs about what I might do differently. That is all. That's all I got. Thank you for coming.